This is Mr. Clark, and we are going to talk about today the political institutions, which will also include the political culture and a little bit of linkage institutions, as well as the elections or lack of for China. So basically, not the political history aspect of it as much, but kind of engagement of the political institutions themselves and kind of what makes up political participation in China. So today we're going to start with Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism. The kind of background is of Confucian values, which we've talked about. Some of those include order, harmony, and strict respect of hierarchy. There's also, some of the emperors enjoyed this idea of a mandate from heaven. So in the past, where we've talked about power, authority, and legitimacy, the authority of the emperors was derived from the mandate from heaven. Also, within but let's return briefly to this idea of Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism because it's going to involve a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So Marxist theory is this idea that the structure of the economy tells all. There's a lot of criticisms of Marx and whatever his alternative is to capitalism and the inevitability of that he predicts of such. But one thing that he's respected as for certain is a historian. His idea of looking at history through the lens of the haves versus the have-nots provides a really good kind of controlling narrative for why and how conflict has happened in our traceable histories. And so it's important to, when we discuss Marxism, to kind of see it through that lens, that power structure lens of those that possess more versus those that don't, and the constant the constant battle that occurs between them. After Marx, we talked about Lenin and the Russia unit. Lenin saw imperialism as the final stage of capitalism, and his idea was that to challenge this imperialism, that it was no longer possible for the proletariat to rise up by themselves, that they actually needed a vanguard in order to do this. This is something that Mao takes and kind of adds his own twist on, but very much this vanguard is this educated group that can help lead the proletariat to having a successful communist revolution. And then obviously the concept of guardianship, or people who are looking out for the best interests of the proletariat in order to make sure that the transition to socialism and then to communism is successful. Mao's additions to kind of the Marxist canon included peasantry as the chief revolutionary force. This is because of the rural makeup of the majority of China at the time. And he also brings us the doctrine of the mass line. We'll talk about that a little bit more in depth later in the slide, but as a kind of short introduction, it's the idea of ideas originating at the top with Mao and then being fed down and then kind of taught ground up, even though they're ideas that came from the top, that the peasantry would actually then enforce those in restricting and curtailing the power of their immediate landlords or the rich that have had a controlling interest in their work prior. And so that's how a lot of hierarchies were upset originally, and something that different versions of this have been used and embraced by subsequent leaders, and we'll talk about that too. Also, this idea of policy of mass mobilization, We watched in the movie The Great Leap Forward about how the entire country could be mobilized from just from the wishes of Mao into doing large tasks in a very short amount of time, and very collectively and organized. Now those weren't always the best ideas. For example, the killing of the sparrows, or the planting of rice too close to each other. But nonetheless, it's something that was has been utilized in order to have everyone kind of act in concert within China. Now we'll move to kind of some of the Chinese political culture basics. As I said on the prior slide, one of those is Confucian values, order, harmony, and hierarchy. Also within China, you see a high concentration of ethnocentrism. Later in the lecture, we'll talk about political cleavages that do exist, but China is very extremely ethnocentric, with very small minority populations, which has led to a strong sense of cultural identity, where you've had the same group of people for thousands of years, kind of shielded off from much of the rest of the world. And when they are encountered, even though there were spheres of influence, there weren't really direct colonial supervision. Also, it's important to note Maoist values are now endemic in Chinese political culture. This includes collectivism, active participation in the quote-unquote struggle while following the Guardian's lead. This would also include what we referenced on the prior slide of the mass line as a source of the party people communicate with each other in the way that what needs to be done gets passed down the line. This idea of egalitarianism is important, but you shouldn't confuse, as we've mentioned before, egalitarianism with any form of anti-hierarchy. There's the importance of hierarchy that still does exist. It's just a different form of hierarchy. And also the local initiative was also encouraged, as long as it is in concert with the party line. And the ideology of Maoism is something that was kind of attributed to what was considered political legitimacy. After that, we had Deng Xiaoping and his successors. What they added to this political culture mix includes pursuit of wealth and leave governing to the party. And so kind of instead of trying to have an effect on that, it's very much a hands-off approach, and you're very much disincentivized from having opinion that is contrary to that of the parties. Also, criticism of the government is not tolerated, and to do so in public, you have run the risk during Mao and other even more recent times about being told on by your neighbor. It's not something that is okay in the political culture to badmouth the CCP or the president. And economic performance is also a source of political legitimacy. So the faster that China's economy continues to grow, the more legitimate that Deng Xiaoping and his successors are seen to be. Now we'll talk about the major political cleavages. The ethnic cleavages: 8% of China's population is made up of 55 minority groups. Mostly are located on the frontiers of the country, and in the far west, in what are considered the 5 autonomous regions. And even though they really only have limited autonomy. Islamic groups are increasingly represented. But it is important that even though it is so ethnocentric, that there are also regional differences that do exist, even among the dominant Han Chinese. And a lot of instances, Deng Xiaoping's speeches would require subtitles because most Chinese could not understand his Sichuan accent. And so it is important to know, even though there is that sense of ethnocentrism, that distinctions still exist even within the Han. The next one I'd want to reference is the rural versus urban cleavage that exists. Economic progress is highly uneven. So rural incomes are only 40% of those who live in the cities. That's why you've seen this mass urbanization and continued urbanization that exists in China. 75% of the population is still rural, but migration to the cities continues to be on the rise. Rural education has also declined as the youth to live in those rural areas will usually leave school for unskilled jobs. And some of the urbanization means that some of those unskilled jobs are also in the cities. There's also what's called a floating population of more than 100 million who will just go wherever the work is and doesn't have an area that they would call home. Something, an internal migrant working force that, could be a political force in the future. Also, there's another cleavage that's important to know, the young versus old. The students have, as they interact with more information, even with the heavy regulated internet, that taste and kind of especially among some of the rich that have more exposure to Western educational institutions, have a stronger distaste for authoritarianism and the regulation of information. But they're also aware that the government will crack down vigorously. So even if they are in a position of privilege with money, that they would still be threatened in China if they rebel too much against that. And so a lot of the rebellion that does exist finds its expression in music, internet sites, and there's also a rise of the apolitical urban materialists, which don't care but are very much interested in wealth and what the wealth can do for them in their daily lives. So those are some of the political cleavages. The next video that we'll start with will continue to discuss about the political culture and political institutions, and we'll stop with political cleavages for this video and start with the Chinese Communist Party for the next video.